Good evening, everyone. That is good evening to those of you in Israel, and good afternoon to those of you in North America and Europe and elsewhere. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. I'm the regular host of our Wednesday English Zoom events, which we've been doing now for almost a year since we were no longer able to do events physically here at the Begin Center. And every week we've been hosting different speakers on a variety of topics, basically in the fields of Israeli politics, Israeli security, the wider Middle East, the Jewish world, Israeli history, really things that are of interest to us here at the Begin Center and to those who I think have been visitors and participants in our programs in the past. I'll just, let me also say, I think we probably have a combination of people that are regulars, people that have tuned in before, and first timers. To all of you, I want to tell you that this is not the camera I normally use, and I'm not actually this pale. So I'm a little concerned that those of you who've seen, who are regulars to this will think there's something wrong with me, that it's just a change in camera. I'm particularly aware that my mother might be tuning in, so Mum, I'm fine. And to first timers, I hope next time you see me, I'll be looking a little more healthy with a different camera. But to the serious events that we're going to be discussing today, we're going to be talking about the very contemporary issue of Iran, specifically the developments in the nuclear in Iran's nuclear program and the responses of both Israel and the United States to that. Before I introduce our speaker, which I'll do momentarily, let me just say that after she and I have spoken for 20-30 minutes, we'll go to questions from all of you, and you can write your questions into the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll read out some of those for our guests to answer. So let me introduce our guest. We're very happy and privileged to have with us Helit Bar-El, who's the former executive director of the Council for Peace and Security, and has served in recent years as a member of its executive board. She was also from 2000 to 2002 director at the Israel National Security Council, heading the US-Israeli bilateral desk. Prior to that, she worked at the Congressional Research Service in Washington, D.C., authoring several reports for Congress on issues related to weapons of mass destruction, so very helpful for us this evening, and at the Institute for National Security Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Helit is also a founding member and former executive board member of the Devora Forum, which is for women in foreign policy and national security, and of the Israel Nuclear Forum. She has a BA from Hebrew University and an MA in Public Policy from Harvard University. So Helit, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, good to be here this evening.
Great. So let's start with I think a little bit of background. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with the issues, but let's go back a little to the years of the Obama administration, when the United States and 4 other countries negotiated this deal with Iran, known as the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, or whatever people want to call it. And Israel was, under Prime Minister Netanyahu, was very much opposed to the deal. Can you tell us a little bit about what this deal actually entailed, and what were Israel's reasons for being so against it?
Right. Well, as any of you who may have followed this issue back in the day, it was very, very controversial, the issue of this deal. And generally, as any negotiated agreement goes, it had obviously its advantages and its disadvantages. And from the Israeli perspective, the real important flaws that were that were pointed out, I would break it down to three major categories. The first being the issue of R&D, research and development, which basically Iran was allowed to continue and develop things like centrifuges, which we're seeing now. They had just installed and tried out new generation centrifuges, IR9s. And that was an issue that was a point of concern, because basically it meant as soon as the agreement does run out or broken down, Iran finds itself at a much more modern and up-to-date place than it does otherwise. So if you're allowed to continue the R&D, your position when the agreement ends in terms of enriching and racing towards nuclear military capability is a better one. The second issue I would point out was an issue about, it's probably the most important one, and that is what we call the sunset clause, which basically means this is an agreement that has a definite end to it. There's one point at 10 years and then another point at 15 years. So basically you're saying you're just kicking the can down the road. You're not really dealing with the problem. You're not really breaking down, decomposing this nuclear capability or this nuclear program. What you're doing is you're just delaying the progress. The problem, and you're going to have to deal with it again anyway. So that is what we call the sunset clause. And the third one is that the American perspective was that the nuclear deal needed to be dealt with immediately and in a separate way. So they isolated the nuclear issue and dealt with the nuclear issue and brought a nuclear deal. But there were things that were very important to Israel and others, such as Gulf neighbors of Iran, that were left out of it, primarily the issues of ballistic missiles, ballistic missile capabilities, which are dealt in a different way within the UN Security Council, but not in an effective enough way. And those were not included really in the body of in any substantial way in the agreement. And the issue of Iran's regional behavior, terrorism, human rights, regional unrest. So it was not, although it was called a joint comprehensive plan of action, it was not a comprehensive deal from an Israeli perspective. That was a problem. From an American perspective, or an Obama perspective, shall we say, the Obama administration perspective, it was basically an answer to Netanyahu's prior plight, where he basically said, Iran is months away from achieving the quantity of enriched material it needs to then break through to a bomb. And so they said, yes, this is serious enough so that we separate this from other issues and deal with this. So they basically dealt with that problem. So this is not a comprehensive peace accord. It was never meant to be. Also on the issue of the sunset clause, again, proponents of the deal said, well, what we did is buy time. I think the real problem with that was nobody really knew what to do with the time bought. I think buying time was not a bad idea at the point in time the agreement was signed. It was a very critical point in time. But the question of what you do with the time that you buy was never really solved. And on the issue of R&D, I don't think there's really anybody who can say, hey, that was, it's fine. What we got was fine. I think that was a concession that went too far for sure. And it's hard to, it's not a perspective issue in my mind. It's kind of hard to justify that particular issue. And then there were other issues that were not minor, but probably secondary in terms of inspections, which a lot of people wanted them to be more intrusive, especially challenge inspections on sites that are unknown. So if we find out all of a sudden through, let's say, Mossad activity, that there's 2 sites that we didn't know about, how do we get to inspect those? Because the agreement covers very specific sites and actually gives very good inspection abilities within those sites. But as Donald Rumsfeld once said, we don't know what we don't know, right? So there was that issue, for example, and there were many others, but those were the 3 main issues. Of course, I think it's very important to put it in a larger context of Israeli-US relations, because it was a huge strain on Israeli-US relations, both because of the substance of the matter, and the difference of opinion in terms of the strategic importance of doing this and how to do this, but also in terms of process and due process and how it was carried out. And Prime Minister Netanyahu going to Congress because he probably thought it was that important. And I don't think he didn't know the price or the cost of what he was doing, but certainly I think we can see that we're paying the price even today. So in terms of, in general terms of the agreement, its flaws, its advantages, I think that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you very much. That's really a useful starting point. And then President Trump comes in, and he'd actually run on a platform as part of his platform that he was going to. This was a terrible deal, the worst deal ever, is the language that he would usually use. But when America withdrew from the deal, it was under Trump. It was I think applauded by the Israeli government. Would it be fair to say that although Netanyahu's opposition to the deal when Obama signed it seemed to be very broadly shared in Israel along the political spectrum, but if I recall, when America withdrew, some of the people who had opposed the deal in the first place weren't sure that America withdrawing was the best move. So there wasn't the unanimity in Israel that America's withdrawal was the right response to this bad deal. Is that fair?
Right. I think that's fair, and I think it's also a correct analysis of the strategic situation there. So in other words, it's not a matter just of withdrawing from the agreement. Let me set it this way. President Trump came in with his antipathy for this deal well known. And I can tell you from, as somebody who works on this issue, the Iranians were horrified of what he was going to do. And so were the Europeans. And what President Trump had working for him was that authentic kind of inherent deterrence that he had, because unlike within the Obama administration, they knew he was looking for an out from this agreement. So playing along the red lines of the agreement, which is what they had started doing before, was not going to go over. So first of all, it was clear that under Trump, the agreement would have to be enforced and compliance would have to be 100%, which is why, that worked well. The other thing is because he was so antagonistic to this deal and had expressed it so clearly, he had the Europeans running scared with the Iranians, trying to figure out what they could do to keep him in the agreement. Now, that was huge leverage. That was a huge card. And to me, it was misplayed by this unilateral, sudden, leaving from the agreement without getting any actual gains for it. So in other words, I don't think the problem is leaving the agreement. I think many of us thought at some point you would have to leave this agreement because you couldn't let it get too close to the sunset point, right? Because then you just leave Iran like that. So you have to leave it. You have to recreate a situation, either of negotiation. So creating that crisis is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is timing. There's really no sense in doing that at year 3 of the agreement rather than at year 7, for example, right? It made no sense because we had bought time. That was the price you paid with sanctions and lifting sanctions. That's the price you paid. And the goods you were getting was the time that you were buying and extending the situation and allowing more options to be developed. And so I didn't really get, so there was, I think, a real possibility to get at that point in time before he left the agreement, some sort of concessions. I don't think there would have been extreme concessions in terms of sunset or in terms of R&D, but yes, maybe something external like on ballistic missiles and other things, especially because Europeans were definitely very eager to maintain the agreement and were very mobilized to pressure the Iranians into that. And so there was a point there, I think, of great opportunity that was missed by just unilaterally leaving this agreement. And I never was sure. And I asked the people from the administration that I met with and that I come into contact, I asked them, what is the plan? And honestly, I really don't think that there was one. The general plan was this idea of maximum pressure. So, and as I think, if you don't know, we should introduce this now, that the Trump administration had added, especially before he left, various sanctions that were not included under the JCPOA. They're separate sanctions and they cover very important areas for Iran, but they're unilateral US sanctions. And when the agreement, when the United States left the agreement, the Europeans, as you know, didn't leave with the United States. So there are certain things that the United States leverages such that still manage to really hurt Iran, such as the central banking sanctions and so on. But there are other things where European work curtailed those sanctions. And when Europeans weren't working together with the Americans, I'm not even talking about China and Russia, that's obvious, but the E3, what we call the three European partners to this agreement, that also negated the efficacy of that move. And I think all of those things, were not lost on anybody in the Israeli system. I think, the people who supported that move in Israel were thinking about more in a kind of declarative way. And, it's a question of who's right and who's wrong from a pragmatic policy point of view. I really didn't see the benefits of leaving at that point in time and in that way. And I think what we're seeing now is how hard it's going to be even to reconstruct what you already had. Trump, in my mind, had a lot of leverage that he could play with, but perhaps he was more ideological than pragmatic about it. And the price we paid in the meantime is that Iran was not completely off the hook, but pretty much, said, okay, the U.S. left the agreement. Now we're going to do what we're going to do. And we saw them. We saw them with newer centrifuges, going over the limits of uranium quotas that they had, and so on. So. And there was no mechanism in place to stop them, where the idea was maximum pressure from the United States would cause such disarray and such economic strife the way it did the first time, that they would come back and there would be a great deal. Well, it didn't happen. It didn't happen with Iran. It didn't happen with North Korea. So on the nuclear level, I remain concerned.
Right. And it's quite striking that when you think about Iran's economic situation, not just the sanctions, but the crippling effect that Corona has had in Iran, and still it's not been enough to force them to concede in the way that the Trump administration seemed to hope that they would.
Right, and I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. As you move along. I mean. You look at North Korea, I sometimes say very sadly that, the population there is about to start eating missiles because that's all they have. I mean, the situation there is so bad. But the authoritarian regime is such that there's no real option. It doesn't really matter. Now, in Iran, certainly is not a democratic country and is very authoritarian. However, it's not North Korea. So the hope was that you would stir something inside and that, the process would be different. But again, it hasn't happened, and I think it was wishful thinking. I think it wasn't very well thought out. It was hope. It wasn't policy.
Okay, so that brings us up to where we are and obviously Joe Biden ran for office with the express intention of returning to the deal, albeit I think it's fair to say that Israel was somewhat comforted by the language used by him and others like Secretary of State Antony Blinken about the type of New Deal they wanted to make that would be tougher, and that they would sort of keep in mind the concerns of Israel and the Gulf states. To what extent? Because now maybe you can update us on this. I believe there were indirect talks going on in Vienna. Where do we know where those talks are at, and if so, how concerned should Israel be that JCPOA Mark II will be the same as the original?
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of the talks that are going on, and they are going on and they are continuing when they remain indirect for the time being, I think the United States, Iran sees a direct meeting with the United States. Like they're trying to build it up as a concession that they would give as a negotiating card. They always do that. It's the interesting thing is that there are people on the American team like Richard Nephew, who's highly involved in the sanctions the time before. They're from the Obama administration. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman ran, a big part of it. So the people are very experienced with these negotiations. They know this agreement. They're not learning it for the first time. Not necessarily Rob Malley, who's leading the team specifically, but the people around him and so on. So it's kind of a second round for a lot of these people. But having said that, look, the language that you were talking about that we're all hanging on to is, I think it was Anthony Blinken who said longer and stronger, right? Those are the words he coined to give us hope about the agreement. But it's very important to understand that's not what's going on now. They're not talking about longer and stronger in this point in time. At this point in time, they are talking about basically re-entering and reinforcing the JCPOA. And there are, of course, a lot of glitches and bumps along the road. Like obviously Iran is demanding that all sanctions be lifted before they comply again with the agreement, whereas the United States says compliance first. The Iranians are demanding lifting all of the sanctions in the United States, including the sanctions that Trump passed right before he left, and those sanctions. Some people call them like Trump's poison pills or whatever, but regardless of how you feel about them, they're there. And they require congressional action to remove. And some of them are very substantial. And so even if Biden wants to, we don't know if he can. And plus, we don't know that he wants to. I would like to remind you that Biden is very, very wise on foreign policy, very experienced on foreign policy. He's not Pollyannish in any way. So him using his congressional clout at this point with a very divided Congress, we all know how it looks, kind of using his credit for this particular thing that I don't even know how much he believes in terms of lifting all the sanctions. He's going to have to find that Aristotelian golden path between what he wants to give and what he doesn't want to give in terms of the sanctions in the United States. So we're still seeing a very bumpy path ahead, even though I think it's fair to say that all parties to the agreement currently are very interested in reinstituting it, all of them. That includes Iran, even though they're trying to play this in a very Iranian way where they're, the US has to do everything. They don't have to do anything because the US is the one who left and all of these things. But in the end, it's going to come down to kind of a practical sitting in a room and figuring those things out. But it's important to understand that that's what we're talking about for these talks. This whole notion of longer and stronger pertains to what the United States is hoping to achieve once the JCPOA is reinstated. So first they're planning on reinstating it, and then they're planning on trying to get some sort of substantive deal that's different, whether it's because they're going to change the sunset clause, whether it's because they're going to give other incentives. I'm not clear on kind of design and implementation as far as how that goes. I understand the notion. Of course, you want a longer and stronger agreement. We all do. How you're going to get there, I don't really know at the moment. And I haven't really heard any kind of blueprint for it. From the Israeli perspective, I think you can already see that it's a different ball game. This isn't Obama, and this isn't the Obama administration. Certainly it's not the Trump administration. So that's the first realization. So we're not seeing the same kind of, super strong response from Israel that we did before. Sure, we're seeing expressions of concern and antagonism towards the deal and all the usual explanations, which are very important about, how important this is to Israeli security and why this, where the flaws are and why this is a problem. But we're not going to see Netanyahu flying to Congress to talk to them, behind Biden's back. That's not happening. As it is, Netanyahu and Biden, we know, have a kind of an open account from the time, from the Obama administration, from several situations that occurred there. And so as it is, this is a relationship that needs to be in a way reconstructed. So you can see that it's a much gentler way of dealing with things. Now, I have to put in a caveat. Also, we've been without a government. We're in a transition government for 2 years. So that also curtails what you can actually do in terms of policy. It's very important to understand. And also the prime minister himself finds himself in a precarious situation politically and legally and all that. So I don't think he has the same kind of ability to do what he did under Obama when he fought it tooth and nail. So we're not going to see kind of a re-happening of that for those reasons, first and foremost, but also I think a learning curve that probably it didn't necessarily pan out so well in the end, the way things were led through the Israeli policy, not because the concerns were misplaced, but because, again, of the conduct and whatnot. And also the main issue there for me as somebody who looks at policy is we were left out of the room. We got ourselves shut out of the room because we were so antagonistic, and it was such a radical way to treat it where we were kind of like, we're having nothing to do with this agreement. And I think it's very important for us to be in the room with the United States. We're not going to be in the room with the entire parties, the JCPOA. We're not invited, and I don't think we should, but with the United States, and especially for if and when there's actually a phase 2 of this agreement, a longer and stronger, how that's crafted, how we're going to go about getting that, how are we going to be involved in it, how are our concerns going to be heard. I think, and we have some of the best policy people in the world on these issues, and it's very important that they actually be allowed to work this issue. And I do hope that lesson was learned.
Okay, so one final question from me before I go to questions. I'm going to remind people again, please write questions in the chat so that I can go to your questions, and Helita is not just hearing from me, but also from what you'd like to ask. Just on Israel's response and Israel's sort of attitude to this. There was the quote unquote mysterious, not so mysterious explosion in Natanz a few weeks ago, which was much less mysterious than usual because Israel actually more or less came clean on it, which was unusual. And is that and I think the response from the United States was not entirely positive about Israel's action, at least from what I read. But can you comment on two things? One is Israel's ongoing action inside Iran to delay things and disrupt. And how does that play into what you just talked about, which is us staying on the good side of the Biden administration and being able to be part of the conversation with the Biden administration and not antagonize it?
Well, I think that's a super important question for 2 reasons. I mean, Israel has to walk a path here between, as you said, its relationship with the United States, which had suffered through the years of Netanyahu and Obama, together, and the implications that it had, I think, for Israel and the Democratic Party and bipartisan support in the Congress and all of that, but specifically from a policy level with the Biden administration. But on the other hand, Israel has real strategic interests that it has to protect, it has to defend, and it has to pursue. And so these 2 things have to, again, be balanced. And I think that the United States and the Biden administration are invested enough in Israel's security and Israel's well-being to understand that. So I don't think you could have expected a happy US response to what happened in Natanz, but all things considered and considering the place where they are with negotiations, actually don't think it was really a negative response. And I would be very surprised if they were left in the dark about this about to happen. I mean, just my assessment, not pretending like I know what the process was, but it did happen when the SecDef was in a visit in Israel. And so certain things you can figure out for yourselves. And the other thing is that I actually think that this kind of situation that happened in Natanz does not necessarily harm the United States within the negotiation, because it is a bargaining chip for the United States as well. I mean, it strengthens the US position. They're saying, hey, you know, you keep doing what you're doing, this is what you're going to get. And let's make no mistakes. The Natanz situation, from everything we know about it, it's a very serious one for Iran. They had just, in this plant, you know, were testing they were still building and installing the centrifuges, which then need to be filled in gas and moved on. But, and these are, you know, new generation centrifuges that, you know, are certainly something that they're very invested in. And there was a lot of damage done. On a side note, I would say one of the most interesting thing is how I don't know if this was a cyber attack because we don't know yet, but we do know of a former cyber attack, Stuxnet, which also had resulted in damage in a centrifuge plant. And in both those cases, if indeed this is cyber or even or kind of a combined situation, it's really interesting to see how cyber ends up affecting the kinetic world, the actual physical world. And those are amazing capabilities and very important for Iran to understand if it is indeed Israel who's doing these things, who they're facing, right? So you're not gonna just run freely towards a nuclear program with or without a JCPOA is the message that's being sent here. That's not happening. And we have the ability to do things about it, or, you know, if it isn't in Israel. And I think that's not necessarily a bad situation for the United States. On the other hand, I do think messages were received kind of loud and clear since, basically saying, okay, from now on, give us some quiet, let us work, let us try and move this thing ahead. I think it's important to understand on Iran, though, this isn't happening only on the nuclear level. It's very important to understand. It's also happening on the regional level. Israel is involved constantly in Syria in basically a proxy war with Iran and carrying out many, many, many attacks, successful attacks, some of them very daring attacks, all of which are imperative for Israeli security. If there's something that we absolutely can't allow is any kind of real Iranian presence in Syria, which it already exists, but the way they're trying to settle themselves there and increase their influence and basically turn Syria into a complete proxy state, that's not something that Israel can afford. And it's something that is very important for the United States to allow Israel to continue to do, to not get in the way, and to figure out the situation of the United States itself in eastern Syria and how that works with the Russians. So this fine line between what Israel needs to do for its own security and how that works with Israeli, US-Israeli relations that are on this issue at times, just at times conflicted, because I do think the overreaching interests are very similar. But on the tactical level, they often collide.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to questions, and my reminder had the desired effect because I've now been flooded with questions. So I'm going to choose a few to start with. Let's go with this one first, which is about the agreement itself, the original agreement itself. And the question is that wasn't there originally a fear that if the US stayed in the agreement, that would result in sanctions being lifted, which in turn would increase Iran's investment in Hezbollah, Hamas, their involvement in Syria, and that would be problematic? And isn't that still a big concern for Israel, that the agreement or a second version of the agreement will not address Iran's involvement in those areas?
Yeah, well, first of all, sanctions were lifted last time around. We have to remember that Iran went through a period of time where the agreement was in place and sanctions were lifted. And that was a main concern. And some money did come into Hezbollah, but it wasn't really the influx that was feared, and that had to do with Iran's dire financial situation and its inability to really divert that many resources, especially at a time where they're also involved in the Syrian civil war and so on and so forth. So again, we would find ourselves in that kind of situation where not sure that the money going to Hezbollah would be a strategic issue, certainly not when you contrast it with the nuclear issue itself, but it certainly is something to watch out for and monitor, which we did very closely at the time. I mean, it was monitored both by the United States and Israel, the influx of money into Hezbollah and what we were seeing. And so, yeah, in general, look, anything that strengthens the Iranian, Syrian, Hezbollah axis over there is of great concern. But here again, it's a balancing act, and it's a question of what would, for example, strengthen them more, a nuclear military capability or the lifting of sanctions and reintroduction of, flow of cash and so on. So certainly wouldn't be perfect. Certainly we would rather have them not have a nuclear program and not have the money, but that doesn't seem to be on the table.
Okay. A couple more clarifying questions about the JCPOA itself. I'll ask both of them. One is about Iran's failure to adhere to the quotas and limitations that were outlined in the JCPOA. And can you speak to that failure? And the question also asks, did the Obama administration and the IAEA know, or I could add, suspect that Iran would violate them going into the deal?
I think we have to separate the two kind of statements. One is, did Iran violate the deal while the United States was still in the deal and was, when the deal was on, right? Yeah. Before the United States. So I don't know of any real good evidence that they did during that period of time. Since the United States left the agreement, for sure, they were supposed to have 300 kilos of enriched uranium, and we know they have 13, and they're not necessarily concealing it all that much. It's part of their way of trying to force the United States back into the agreement, or to force the issue on the international community, however you want to see it. And they're making, a full show of the centrifuges that they're installing, which of course they're not supposed to. And they're talking about their facility in Arak, which is the plutonium track that they had that was supposed to be not fully dismantled, but converted. And they were reconstructing it. And again, not in any kind of secret way. It was full statements about how these capabilities were going to come into play again. So, which, by the way, expose some of the weaknesses of the former agreement that really do need to be dealt with. For example, the Arak facility didn't need to be converted. It needed to be dismantled, for just one example, right? If you're going to buy time, if the agreement falls apart and somebody violates it and the Iranians try to go back to the nuclear track, then if the facility is completely dismantled, rather than just converted, you buy a lot of time right there. So there are a lot of things like that that really do need to be addressed and hopefully can be addressed. Yeah, certainly since the United States had unilaterally left the agreement, the Iranians, there's so many instances of non-compliance, and the Europeans are still there. And so we're seeing a sticky situation.
And follow up to that, does the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, does it have access? Did it have and does it have access to Iran's nuclear facilities? Can it make inspections?
Well, it's one of those contentious things just happening as we speak, is that the IAEA is getting, or Iran is threatening to reduce and diminish IAEA access, and do a lot of other things like withdraw from the additional protocol, which they're not signed to, but they are adhering to, and do maybe even withdraw from the NPT, which would then completely negate the whole IAEA authority in the situation. So in the original agreement, the IAEA had very good access to certain facilities that were covered in the agreement. The problem was, as Israel had pointed out and others, again, you don't know what you don't know. If we find out about certain places, we want to go in and inspect them. No, we're just saying exactly that. There are two facilities in Iran that the IAEA wanted to inspect. And in fact, in the last board of directors meeting, that issue came up. And if it's not resolved in a positive way, then in September, there's another meeting of the board of IAEA, and then it would go to the Security Council, because there's certainly a site that was recovered from the archives that the Mossad brought, that was new to them and that they want to inspect. And Iran is saying, no, that was, it was theft and it's not real information. And because it's not real information, we're not going to give you access. So that's a very mixed batch of access. Did the JCPOA give much more access than we ever had before in Iran or anywhere else? Sure. Was it enough access? Probably not.
Right. Thank you very much. And there's a question here which is kind of asking for clarification on some of your comments in our earlier conversation. One is when you talked about how Israel is paying the price for Netanyahu addressing Congress, what were you referring to? That is the first question. The other one is, it says that the Trump administration withdrew after 18 months following his inauguration. Do we know for sure that the administration did not seek concessions which Iran refused?
Yeah, so the first question is kind of a larger question to me about U.S.-Israeli relations. And, just because obviously I'm Israeli, I live in Israel, but I have many loved ones in the States, and any of you who do, it was a huge problem for American Jewish people. Their communities were really affected by it. A lot was going on, but mostly I think it created a rift with the Democratic Party because it was seen as something where Netanyahu was coming up personally against this Democratic president. And I think, there's something there still. I think that this obvious bipartisan support, which Biden, by the way, is a strong proponent of himself and always has been, a very strong supporter of Israel. I don't think we can just assume that it's there. I think you're going to have to work for it and on it. And I don't know that in this particular issue, because the history on the nuclear deal issue was so kind of volatile between Israel and the United States, what level of sharing and cooperation we can expect to find just a priori coming into it. Now I have to say that of course might change, like there might be a different prime minister in Israel as well. And then all that baggage in a personal level, that baggage isn't there. There's still other things that will be going on. So I just think it's a stickier situation. And it's kind of not exactly a polar opposite, but a very different situation than the Israeli government was used to with the Trump administration. It's a very different administration. It's not that kind of relationship. So that's one thing. And it's, again, not to say that I suspect that this administration is in any way not supportive of Israel, of Israel's strategic needs and so on. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's a different kind of relationship. And on the Trump issue, look, I wasn't inside the Trump administration, so I can't tell you, but I think it's pretty safe to say from everything that we've known, and Trump himself has been very outspoken about it. He wanted out of that agreement. He wasn't trying to mend it. He wanted to blow that up. And he really did want to bring a new achievement and a new agreement. And I think he believed in this idea of his and Prime Minister Netanyahu's of maximum pressure, and that it would lead to something better and put him in a better position. But it just never came to fruition. President Trump, you might remember, as part of the JCPOA, had to certify to Congress about every 6 months that Iran was in compliance with the agreement. And he hated doing that. He hated signing that paper. So that's what he did it once. And then he said, he already put stipulations on it the first time he signed it, if I remember it correctly at some point. And then in May, he kind of said, okay, there's 6 months more, but then I'm done. So it was, my assessment is that there was not really, it wasn't a stated goal to take this agreement and leverage it. I think the stated goal was to leave it. And again, you know, people say a lot of things about President Trump, but this is one of the things he said he was going to do, and he did it. You know, there were other things he did as well. You know, he said he was going to do certain things. They sounded outlandish, and he did them.
Right. And as I recall, I think the European countries in the agreement also complained that Trump hadn't sought to engage them before the.
For sure. The French were trying very, very hard. The Brits were trying very, very hard, and it just wasn't there. And that was his policy.
Right. So there's a couple of questions which are, shall we say, a little either suspicious or not so favorable towards the either the intentions or motivations or abilities perhaps of the current American administration. So I want to put those to you. One is that you yourself said that many of the same people from the Obama administration are now negotiating the same agreement, which set this very low bar. So what makes you think they want to do a better job of it now, that they're actually serious about the longer, stronger thing that Antony Blinken said? And the second question along those lines is, I'll read it as it's written. We know that Clinton's administration made a deal with North Korea to supposedly prevent a North Korean bomb, but now North Korea has the bomb. As I recall, Wendy Sherman was part of negotiating that deal. Since everybody knows that North Korea has the bomb, why should we assume that the purpose of these talks with Iran and the JCPOA is to prevent an Iranian bomb?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the second question.
I think he's saying that because the deal with North Korea was not successful, and America seems to be going along the same lines with Iran. I believe the inference that I'm drawing from his question is that we shouldn't be so sure that America is that concerned about whether that Iran would get the bomb or not. And that's from Eliyahu, and you can comment, Eliyahu, on the chat and tell me if I'm wrong or right with that inference.
Okay. So first on the, I guess the staffing issue on the JCPOA. Yeah. Again, not saying these are not all the same people, but they are people who, not all of them, but some of them who are very experienced with the material. And we have to understand things like the sanction question is extremely, extremely complicated from a legal standpoint, financial standpoint, diplomatic standpoint. In terms of knowing the material and their knowledge on the issue, I think it's definitely a positive. I have to say, regardless of who's sitting there and doing the negotiations, I'm very pessimistic about today, at this point, being able to really achieve anything better than the JCPOA. At this point, it's kind of a battle to regain where things were before. You have to understand that unilaterally leaving the agreement left the United States in a position where it's kind of clawing its way back into the agreement. That's where we're at, now. Now, it's true that Iran also has an interest in this agreement, and certainly the Europeans want it reinstated and so on. But no matter which staff is negotiating and is motivating this, it's not going to be. Think about the constellation. Why would Iran agree now to anything that it didn't agree to when they were negotiating for the JCPOA? When they were negotiating for the JCPOA, they were under sanctions from the entire world, including Russia and China. It was a really multilateral effort, a very strong one. It's the only thing that brought them to the table. It wasn't their goodwill, for sure. It was the strife and the difficulty of such comprehensive sanctions. In fact, the Europeans went farther than the United States in imposing sanctions. And I think it ties in a little bit to the next question, because they understood that this situation with a potentially nuclear Iran does not affect the United States alone, it possibly affects Europe more than it affects the United States strategically. So, just on ballistic missiles alone, they have ballistic missiles that may not reach the United States, but they sure as hell will reach Europe. I mean, there's no question about that. If they go, over 2,000 kilometers, You know, they're not just going one way. So, and I think the Europeans are very clear on that. And that was part of why they had engaged in this. Look, for the Europeans to get together and impose that as their biggest success as a European entity ever, right? They weren't supposed, in foreign policy, they're not very good at imposing kind of a European, cross-European policy. So, and under that kind of extreme pressure and facing basically everybody and being completely isolated and having even Russia and China that stand out for it, this is what they were able to achieve is the JCPOA. So why would they now, where their position, I would argue, is much improved, because although they had a lot of strife, and we've seen it happen with COVID, and we know that there's a lot of political issues and everything, but they haven't caved under maximum pressure. And the maximum pressure, I don't think, amounted to the maximum pressure of the entire world. You know, when it's the US alone, ultimately it's the US alone. And so now they're facing an Iran that's somewhat emboldened. It already has the structure of the JCPOA. The Europeans are already part of it. You know, they've never really just abdicated. So I don't think it's very realistic I think the real question is, people are asking, should the Biden administration really strive to get back into this agreement and reinstate it as it is, even if as a first stage? Is it better than leaving things as they are now? And that's again, it's the same question that we found ourselves with the first round of the JCPOA, which is it better to buy some time, or is it better to say, let's hope that they collapse, cave in, implode, or whatever it is before they reach a nuclear military capability? And as somebody who deals primarily with nuclear deterrence in my work, I don't want them to have a nuclear weapon, and I don't want that above all. So I understand the need to buy time, but I also understand all the flaws that go along with it. And I think the real challenge here and the real questions here have to do with the phase 2, longer and stronger. Now, on the second part of the question, I don't believe for a second that the United States wants Iran to have a nuclear military capability. Not at all, certainly not the Europeans either. I think the implications of having a nuclear Iran are extremely far reaching. You know, I've done a lot of work on what it would look like, right? A nuclear balance within the Middle East, and what would happen if they did indeed cross the threshold and looked like a nuclear adversary. And I'm telling you, we don't want to go there. I think I don't think, again, I think it's important to understand. Let's say the Iranians, we wake up tomorrow morning, there's something we didn't know and they have a nuclear capability. We're not shutting down the country and moving, right? I mean, we're still going to survive this challenge, but it becomes infinitely more difficult, more dangerous. And I want to point out to that, Israel's not the only one who's invested in Iran not having a nuclear weapon. We have Gulf states that we have agreements with, some of them now, and there are a lot of diplomatic architectures that need to be pursued in this context as well. And I think can be pursued in this context. But it really depends on how strong the United States is on this issue. And I know this is kind of convoluted, but I do want to add to this. I think the United States stance in the Middle East in general is very important. I know they're trying to keep separate the nuclear agreement and everything else that goes on with Iran, but I don't think it ultimately is possible. And I think with the level of aggression that Iran has been showing towards American targets in the last few months, and the very meek American response, conventional, I'm not talking about anything on the nuclear level, I don't think that bolsters a very strong American position coming into the negotiation. And I think that's something that needs to be reassessed.
That's a really important point. Let's just quickly look at the other countries that were signatories to the JCPOA. So it's China and Russia, and then the 3 European countries, the UK, France, and Germany. We have a question here that since the US wasn't the only signatory to the agreement, why didn't the other countries insist on compliance after the United States left? You said that after the US left, there were multiple breaches of the agreement. So how come the other countries didn't insist on compliance? And the second part of the question is, what does China's new 25-year economic agreement with Iran say about I guess China's seriousness in upholding the agreement?
Right. Well, the Europeans were, again, as somebody looking at it from the outside, because I'm more of an American, U.S., Israeli kind of thing, but they were part of this agreement. Looking at it from the outside, they seem to me to be somewhat traumatized by a lot of things in the Trump administration, not just the nuclear issue. And I think that the way that the United States withdrew from the agreement kind of pushed them into Iranian arms and allowed Iran ultimately to get away with more than I would have thought with the European signatories. But I do think the Iranians as well, when they're saying things like, oh, you're gonna hurt our plant in Natanz, well, we're gonna enrich to 60, or we're gonna do whatever, then they're playing against their European partners. And then they're risking losing those partners as well. So they're also, their boldness only has, so much to go as well with that. Why they hadn't left the agreement is because I think they're very, very invested in it. And I think, as long as Trump was there, it was a problem with U.S. European relations as well. So I think it all fed into the same kind of thing. The China issue is very, very important. It's very important for a lot of reasons. One of the things I mentioned before is the United States in general in the Middle East. I think, we all know that Biden is pulling out of Afghanistan with the expressed intention of pulling out in general from the Middle East, Iraq, and possibly Syria. I do hope they don't pull out of Eastern Syria. That would be for Israel a bad situation. And I think also it's a very small investment for the United States, but we'll have to see what happens there. But I'm pointing this out because they're pivoting to Asia. This isn't really news. This isn't just Biden. This is a general strategic arch of the United States. It's kind of moving their focus from the Middle East to Asia. No more dependence on oil and on energy from the Gulf the way it was before for the United States. For Europe, it's different. That dependence still is very much there. So what we're seeing is China emerging, certainly on the technological level, as the main adversary for the United States, more than I would say even Russia at this point. And so if that's kind of the trajectory that we're on, we have to understand the role that China plays here and how it stands. We're seeing Russia already standing with Iran on many, many issues and have for very, very long. It's interesting with China. China has also very, very strong energy needs and has had them for, over 20 years. And in the past, there was an ability on the West to implore China and kind of impose on them how important it is, this issue of nuclear nonproliferation and preventing an Iranian nuclear capability. It was always a conversation about that. But it seems to have fallen prey to this US-China competition. And it looks like China is, going to become a stronger ally of Iran. And that's something for Israel to consider as well in two ways. One is Israel's relation with China and Chinese investments in Israel. And the other is where you find yourself in this China-US game as Israel, because we already got caught in it once before with the Falcon, I'll remind you. So I don't know if you all remember that issue. But that was kind of a miniature situation of what might develop here with this great power competition. And if China is really aligning itself with Iran, and I'm saying if because I want to just make sure, China is very, very complex and very sophisticated foreign policy. It wouldn't do anything that is straight out stupid. It never has. So it's something to be very, very cautious about.
Okay. We're coming up to the hour, but I want to go maybe just a couple more questions, if that's okay with you. We haven't talked about, except very briefly with Natanz, Israel's, what options are open to Israel? Now, there is of course the elephant in the room of the threat of an Israeli military strike, as we did in Iraq, as we did in Syria. Everyone knows that it's a whole other ball game with Iran, where there's multiple sites and they're underground and they're spread around the country. It's not the same as with the other two attacks on nuclear facilities in Iraq and Syria. But is that something that could be back on the table if, let's say, the JCPOA, a version of it is signed? It might be longer and stronger, but still not quite up to what Israel would like it to be. Could Israel just get too concerned at the danger of an Iranian nuclear threat and attack, in your estimation?
I think this is an option that absolutely has to be on the table, and I'd go as far as saying not just from Israel, it has to be from the U.S. side. I think that, and Obama, by the way, always said it was on the table, and whether he meant it or not, that statement is important. That semblance is important. And I think shying away from the concept of use of force will not serve, not on the Iranian nuclear issue and not in the Iranian stance in the Middle East. I'm not saying the United States needs to get up and attack Iran, but, and I'm all for diplomacy. And I think diplomacy, soft power can be, employed in many ways, and it's important. But there's other forms of power that don't need to be off the table at all. That's something that's it's got to be one of the legs of the United States policy. It certainly can't be and won't be the only one. That's not what this administration is about. And I appreciate the more subtle and more nuanced policies and the way things are thought out and constructed. But I don't think the use of force can and should be counted out by the United States on this issue. Now, would Israel go it alone? We don't really know. I'll remind you that leading up to the JCPOA, one of the stronger incentives for Iran, first of all, was the sanctions. Nothing would have happened without them. But the credibility of an Israeli military option was at the time very, very high. I mean, everybody was worried about it. The United States was worried about it, and Iran was worried about it. And I think that was one of the things that helped those negotiations move along. And that's what I meant also when I mentioned Natanz. So the Israeli ability to carry and desire to carry up one is an inherent deterrent to certain things. Will Israel actually act on it? I really can't answer. I think that has to do with a lot of operational issues that we can and shouldn't get into in any public way. We always have to ask ourselves, what can you actually achieve? And as somebody who studies nuclear deterrence, I will tell you, we really have to ask ourselves in a timing kind of way. It's different to take military action against an aspiring nuclear country and to take action against a nuclear adversary. And if we are convinced that we are going to have a nuclear adversary in Iran, that kind of requires back planning on any action you might take, because strategic deterrence balances are very delicate. You have to really think about what you do and you don't do, but absolutely it has to be on the table. And I think Israel has always kept it on the table.
Right. Yeah, that's a really great point. And the importance of the deterrence. I wonder, when you mentioned the fact that Obama made the statement was important, and I wonder whether the fact that the infamous retreat from the red line over Syria, I think, maybe harmed that American deterrence somewhat. Would that be fair?
I think for sure it harmed the American deterrence, and some people think it was, a huge strategic mistake. Yeah. As an Israeli who gave back my little chemical masks and all those things that my kids had to wear and all that, and I didn't need them anymore. I was willing to pay the strategic price for the avoidance of chemical weapons in Syria. So if someone were to offer the deal to me that we would retract an ultimatum, but we could dismantle Iranian nuclear capabilities, I'm signing. But that's unfortunately not on the table. What I'm trying to say is, I think Obama got an important commodity for us in return for paying a very high price for American credibility in the region.
Interesting. So let's just end with this, and it's not something we've discussed really. Iran has its own presidential elections coming up, and obviously we know that the final say in Iran is not with the elected president, but with the unelected supreme leader. But he may also be replaced because he's from what we hear, he's not too well and he's an old man. So who knows when that could happen. So I guess my question is whether either a new president and or a replacement of Khamenei as supreme leader could change things, could make Iran more or less willing to make concessions that would be helpful for Israel.
I'll start this by prefacing that I'm not a Iranologist, whatever, domestic policy, person. My interest with them is strategic and nuclear and so on. But it's very interesting what's going on with the Iranian election. First of all, it poses a certain deadline, and it's a little bit hard for me at this point to discern whether they would like to get this done on the Iranian side before the election, or if they're playing for time until August, when there's a new government and a new prime minister and a new president, and then kind of pawn it on to the next one. It's a question of the balance within Iran, right, between reformists and conservatives, where who is going to gain from this agreement. Now, conservatives are truly against this agreement and have been all along. So it's interesting because if you're going back into this agreement, you probably need Rouhani and Zarif in their positions so that you don't have to have someone who's not a reformist do it, because then how do you get along? On the other hand, if you're looking at a longer term negotiation, it might give them a better stance. So I'm not clear whether the supreme leader has decided if he's going to finish this before the election or not. I think it'd be very interesting to watch if he's vying for time. And on him, let me just put it this way. He's been an old man for a long time. And I don't really know what it would look like, if he left or was replaced during this period of time. I don't think it would be particularly positive. But that's because I am biased against transition periods. And generally, I feel that transition periods are very volatile, especially in the Middle East, and they don't usually work well for us.
Including our own.
Certainly including our own, but thankfully, hopefully we have some mechanisms, and hopefully this will be resolved. But we've seen it everywhere around us in the Middle East, how it pans out and what it looks like. And I think it could be very, very painful, but I do think there are mechanisms in Iran still that would prevent it becoming this. But it's one of those things where I don't really have any analytical insight. I think it's a wait and see.
Okay. That concludes the conversation, I think. And Helene, I want to thank you so much. There were a lot of questions. We covered a huge amount of ground, and you really managed to give extraordinary amounts of detail and insight for every one of those questions. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you to everyone for joining. We'll have another event next week. Look out for that. Those of you on my email list, you'll get my email. Those of you who are not, who would like to be, drop me an email, paulg@begincenter.org.il. Also find us on our Facebook page and our website. I think this Iran issue is something we're definitely going to be coming back to because it's not going to be concluded anytime soon. But thank you, everyone, and have a great day, a great evening, and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Good night.